Hello and welcome to another Retfurb video. Today we're going to be repairing this NAD 3020A amplifier front fascia panel. This panel has had a previous crack repair. Unfortunately I didn't start the camera and I just noticed, so I'd already started rubbing it down a little bit, but you can see where the repairs once were. So it's going to be difficult to replicate the panel exactly how it is. Unfortunately I've got no way of printing white this small, so I'm going to be printing it in black. I'm going to make the panel gloss instead of matte finish, just so I can seal in the decals when they're on there. You'll see that the decals that I use, once they're lacquered over, it makes them a lot less noticeable where the edges are. You can still see it, but it's a lot better. Over to the refurb then. I started with 320 sandpaper just to get the worst parts out, just so there's no sort of edges where it was glued. The cracks weren't too bad, to be honest, where it was glued previously, but there was an edge on them. So once I got the worst of it out, now I'm moving over to 1000 wet and dry and just getting it wet and doing it that way. It just gets it nice and smooth. You lose any roughness in the plastic by using the rougher sandpaper. Now I'm just going over with a wet tissue just to check it all over, make sure that everything's smooth, make sure there's no edges, make sure it's clean, and then I can move on to looking at priming it. So here I have just noticed there's a little bit of an edge still, so I'm just going to go over that with the wet and dry again, and then hopefully it'll remove it, ready for primer. Here I'm just using a bit of Scotch-Brite. It just means I can get in the edges better than using the paper. It just conforms in around where the switches go and the dials. So with that, it'll make it a lot better and it'll key it up better for paintwork. So just to reiterate what I was saying earlier about what I'm going to finish this like, obviously it's not going to be an original finish. It's not going to look original when it's back on the NAD 3020A, but it'll look a lot better than having a crack. And personally, I'd rather it look clean and tidy rather than having a damage on the front of it and looking rough. So I think once it's finished, it will look good, and obviously it'll just freshen up the front of the panel. So here you can see that now I've applied the primer to the panel. Just one light grip coat and then 2 full coats. Obviously you can put as many primer coats as you want on there. You don't want to go too mad, but you can sort of put 3 or 4 on there, making sure they're drying in between. Once I've done the primer, I noticed that the cracks were a bit visible, so I'm just going to use a tiny bit of super glue on those areas just to use it as a filler, and then we can look at sanding that part down. You don't want to put the super glue in too thick here, because you'll have issues when you come to rubbing it down. Also, just to bear in mind when you do put the super glue in, it might lift the primer. But don't worry about that, we're going to be re-priming it anyway. Just don't build up the super glue too much. Again here, just using 1000 wet and dry, doing it wet and just rubbing it back down, and then it can be ready for another coat of primer. Here you can see I've given it another coat of primer. It's actually had 3 coats of high build primer aerosol on this, just letting it dry off in between. And now we can look at rubbing it down again, just getting it ready for the colour coat. So this is the panel now which has had the colour coat applied. It hasn't had any lacquer or anything on it yet, so obviously it has a matte finish. Ideally I would like to keep it like this and just put the decals on, but it doesn't look that good if you do that. That way you'll see in a minute when I start putting them on, they sort of show up more. So it's got to have a lacquer coat over these decals. Here are the decals that I printed on clear water slide paper. They've just got to be cut out and then they can be transferred onto the panel. So I'm not going to show the process on every single one of these. I'll show the full process on the first one, and then I'll skip through some of them, just showing the bits and pieces in between, but you'll get the process is the same for each one. They just got to be cut out, put in the water, and then transferred over onto the panel and just carefully in place. Here I'm just using a cocktail stick so I can reposition it before final placement. And now just carefully dabbing it off with a dry tissue. Now you need to be careful when you do this because it might move the decal underneath. So that's the first one down, now onto the rest of them. Now something to note when you do use this clear water slide paper, you need to make sure that you get an inkjet or laser jet depending on what printer type you're putting it on. Also, when you do print it, you need to let it dry, and then you need to apply coats of lacquer over the top. Now I just use an aerosol lacquer, which is suitable for this. Just put a couple of coats on, which then seals it in. If you don't do that, it will just mark when you try to do anything with them. So the decals that go around the knobs are a little bit trickier than the rest of them because they've been cut like a horseshoe to go around it. So you just need to take extra care when transferring these over onto the panel. And now that all the decals have been applied, we can now look at giving it a lacquer coat. And this is it, this is the final product. Now I've given it about 3 coats of lacquer. I put first coat on, there was a couple of little imperfections, so I sorted that out, I let that dry off, gave it a little nib off. Just carefully, you don't want to go too mad, obviously it's only had 1 coat. And then I applied another coat, checked it, let that dry off a bit, and then give it another coat. So again, it's not perfect, it's not original obviously, but it looks a hell of a lot better than it did with the crack on the front. There are a few small imperfections, but overall I think it looks really good and I'm happy with it. Keep an eye out for the future video on the NAD 3020A, which is currently being refurbed, that this panel will be going on. Thanks again for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.